For over 600 years, the Habsburg Empire stood as a titan, a sprawling powerhouse that shaped the course of Europe. It ruled over a patchwork of peoples, languages, and cultures, from the snowy peaks of the Alps to the sun-baked plains of Hungary. Millions lived under its banner, believing it to be an unshakable force, a symbol of permanence. But beneath that granite-like exterior, this mighty empire was far more fragile than anyone imagined. It was a giant that constantly stumbled, a colossus that teetered on the brink of collapse not once, not twice, but 5 separate times. Each time, it stared into the abyss, sensing its own end, only to pull back, defying the odds and rewriting history. Get ready to explore the heart-pounding moments when one of the world's longest-lasting empires almost vanished forever. Number 5. The Revolutions of 1848. The year of no sleep. The air in Vienna in early 1848 felt different. It was buzzing with whispers, a nervous energy that crackled through the grand ballrooms and seeped into the crowded coffee houses across Europe. The ground was shaking. News traveled slowly by today's standards, but the reports from Paris of King Louis-Philippe being overthrown landed like a thunderclap. Students, workers, even some disgruntled nobles suddenly felt a jolt of hope. The old way of doing things, the rigid system controlled by the powerful and elderly chancellor, Clemens von Metternich, felt stifling. People wanted change. They wanted more freedom, a say in their own lives, and an end to the crushing poverty that gripped so many. On March 13, 1848, the dam burst. A crowd of students, artists, and workers gathered outside the Diet building demanding reforms. The imperial troops, unsure how to handle such a large and passionate gathering, panic shots were fired. People fell. The city erupted. Barricades, hastily built from cobblestones, furniture, and anything else that could be dragged into the streets, sprang up across Vienna. The sound of gunfire echoed between the ornate buildings. This was not just a protest, it was a full-blown uprising. Inside the Hofburg Palace, Emperor Ferdinand I, a kind-hearted man but one often described as not fully capable of ruling, was in a state of bewilderment. His trusted advisor Metternich, the architect of European order for decades, was suddenly isolated. The crowds were screaming his name, but not in praise. They wanted him gone. Metternich, now in his mid-70s, famously fled the city in disguise, a symbol of the old world crumbling before everyone's eyes. He made his way to England, a place where he hoped the revolutionary fervor had not yet spread. With Metternich gone, the emperor and his advisors made concessions. The monarchy promised a new constitution and more freedoms. For a brief moment, it felt like victory. But the spark of revolution was already flying across the vast empire. The Habsburg lands were a patchwork of different nationalities, each with their own language, history, and often grievances. Now these groups saw their chance. In Budapest, the leader Lajos Kossuth, a fiery orator, gave powerful speeches demanding full independence. For Hungary, a separate parliament and control over their own army. On March 15, just 2 days after Vienna's eruption, the Hungarian Diet passed the April Laws, essentially creating an autonomous Hungarian state within the empire. It was a massive step, one that threatened to tear the empire apart. To many in Vienna, it felt like Hungary was simply walking away. Meanwhile, in Prague, the Czech nationalist movement, led by figures like František Palický, called for greater autonomy for Bohemia. They wanted their own language, recognized their own local government, and more rights for Czech people. In Italy, long simmering resentment against Habsburg rule exploded in Lombardy and Venetia. Milan saw its own 5 days of street fighting pushing out the Austrian garrison. Venice declared itself a republic, reviving old glory. Field Marshal Joseph Radetzky, an old but incredibly sharp military commander, was forced to retreat with his forces into the quadrilateral fortresses, struggling to hold onto what little remained of Austrian control in Italy. The imperial court, now at Olomouc and far from the chaos of Vienna, watched in horror as the empire seemed to unravel. Ferdinand I was advised that he was not strong enough to handle this crisis. On December 2, 1848, Ferdinand I, abdicating-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph, young, inexperienced, but with a steel resolve, Franz Joseph became the new face of the struggling empire. He was put in charge of putting the pieces back together. Franz Joseph's first move was to turn the tide. He decisively defeated the Piedmontese army at the Battle of Novara in March 1849, crushing the Italian hopes for quick independence. In Vienna, Field Marshal Alfred Windisch-Gratz, a firm conservative, had already crushed a second, more radical uprising in October 1848, brutally restoring order. The streets that had once been filled with revolutionary songs now echoed with the heavy boots of imperial soldiers. The barricades were gone, replaced by checkpoints, but Hungary remained the biggest problem. The Hungarian National Guard, joined by many ordinary citizens, had formed a formidable army. Kossuth, now the head of the Hungarian state, declared full independence from Habsburg rule in April 1849. This was no longer just a demand for autonomy. It was an act of open rebellion. Franz Joseph knew he could not defeat the Hungarians on his own. Their army was too strong, their will too great. In a desperate gamble, Franz Joseph appealed to Tsar Nicholas, the First of Russia, the ultra-conservatives, gendarme of Europe. The Tsar, fearing that revolutionary ideas would spread to his own vast empire, agreed to help. Over 200,000 Russian troops marched into Hungary, a massive invading force. Facing two powerful armies, the Hungarian forces, though fighting bravely, were eventually overwhelmed. On August 13, 1849, at Vilagos, the Hungarian army, led by General Artur Gorgi, surrendered to the Russian forces. The revolution was crushed. The aftermath was brutal. Kossuth fled into exile. Many Hungarian generals and leaders were executed. The reforms that had been promised in March 1848 were largely rolled back. The empire was put under harsh military rule, and its internal divisions seemed deeper than ever. Yet the empire had survived. Franz Joseph, now firmly in control, had navigated the storm. But the year of no sleep, as it was called by some, had shown everyone just how many fault lines ran through the Habsburg domains. It was a near-death experience that would haunt the empire for decades, proving that its survival was never a given. Number 4. The Napoleonic Wars, when France almost swallowed the empire whole. Imagine a thunderclap that shakes the very foundations of your world. That is what Napoleon Bonaparte was to the Habsburg Empire. For centuries, the empire, also known as the Holy Roman Empire, had been a sprawling collection of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities, all loosely linked under the Habsburg Emperor. It was old, established, and slow-moving. Then came Napoleon, a whirlwind of military genius and political ambition, who moved at a speed no one had ever seen. The encounters with him were not just battles. They were existential threats that nearly erased the Habsburg name from the map. In the late 1790s and early 1800s, Austria, led by Emperor Francis I, found itself repeatedly on the wrong side of Napoleon's campaigns. The defeats came fast and hard. At Marengo in 1800, and then Hohenland in the same year. Austrian armies were shattered. The peace treaties that followed were humiliating. Austria lost territory, influence, and vast sums of money. Each defeat chipped away at the empire's prestige and power. The people of Vienna, usually so proud, felt a cold dread settle over them. Was this the end of their ancient line of emperors? The biggest blow came in 1805. Austria, along with Russia and Great Britain, formed the Third Coalition against Napoleon. Francis I and his generals believed they could finally defeat the upstart French emperor. But Napoleon's speed and cunning were legendary. He surprised the Austrian forces at Ulm, forcing a massive surrender without a major battle. Then on December 2, 1805, at Austerlitz, in what is often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, Napoleon decisively defeated the combined Austrian and Russian armies. It was a masterpiece of military strategy for Napoleon and a total disaster for the Habsburgs. The French army marched into Vienna, occupying the capital city. The sight of foreign soldiers patrolling the streets was a shock to the system. The Peace of Pressburg, signed later that month, was a dagger to the heart of the Habsburg Empire. Austria lost even more territory, including parts of Italy, and its long-held possession of Tyrol, which Napoleon gave to his ally. Bavaria, the humiliation was profound, but the worst was yet to come. In 1806, Napoleon, now master of Central Europe, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. This ancient institution, which had existed for over 1,000 years dating back to Charlemagne, was simply wiped away. Emperor Francis I, who had been Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire, was forced to give up his historic title. He now became simply Francis I, Emperor of Austria. It was a clear sign that the old order was gone, and the Habsburgs' traditional role as the leading power in Germany was over. The very identity of the empire was fundamentally altered. Despite these crushing blows, Austria, ever resilient, tried again. In 1809, fueled by a surge of nationalism and a desire for revenge, Austria launched the War of the Fifth Coalition. Under the command of Francis I's brother, Archduke Charles, a capable military reformer, the Austrian army scored a shocking victory at Aspern-Essling. It was the first time Napoleon had been defeated in a major battle on the field. Hope soared across Vienna. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning, but Napoleon quickly regrouped. A few weeks later, at the Battle of Wagram, Napoleon delivered another crushing defeat to the Austrians. The losses were horrific. Tens of thousands dead on both sides. The Peace of Schönbrunn that followed was even more punitive than Pressburg. Austria lost more territory, including access to the Adriatic Sea, and was forced to pay a massive indemnity. The empire was crippled financially and militarily. To seal his victory and ensure Austria's subservience, Napoleon demanded a personal sacrifice. From Emperor Francis I, Napoleon, seeking a legitimate heir and greater wife from one of Europe's old royal houses. His choice was Marie-Louise, Francis I's own daughter. For Francis I, it was a heartbreaking decision, a public humiliation, but also a desperate gamble to save his dynasty. He married his beloved daughter off to the man who had shattered his empire. Marie-Louise, just 18 years old, left Vienna. In 1810, her personal life sacrificed for the survival of her family's empire. This forced alliance meant that in 1812, Austria was compelled to send troops to support Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia. Austrian soldiers marched alongside the French, a clear sign of their reduced status, merely a pawn in Napoleon's grand game. The situation felt truly desperate. The empire was no longer a major player. It was a shadow of its former self, seemingly destined to be forever under Napoleon's thumb. But this was where the cunning of Austrian diplomacy, led by the rising Clemens von Metternich, began to shine. While Napoleon was bogged down in Russia, Metternich carefully and secretly began to rebuild Austria's strength and connections with other European powers. When Napoleon finally retreated from Russia, severely weakened, Metternich seized the moment. He joined the new coalition against Napoleon, swinging Austria's rebuilt army into the fight. At the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the Battle of the Nations, the combined forces of Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden decisively defeated Napoleon. It was the beginning of his end. After Napoleon's final defeat, Vienna became the center of the world at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Under Metternich's leadership, Austria played a key role in reshaping Europe. It regained much of its lost territory, though the Holy Roman Empire was not revived. The Habsburgs emerged from the Napoleonic Wars, battered and bruised, but incredibly still standing. They had endured repeated occupations, devastating defeats, the loss of an ancient title, and a forced family sacrifice. They had been on the verge of being swallowed whole, but through a combination of military resilience, diplomatic maneuvering, and sheer will, they had survived the greatest challenge to their existence up to that point. Number 3. The War of the Austrian Succession. The princess who fought for her crown. Imagine being 23 years old, newly married and pregnant with your first child. Now imagine that your father, the emperor, dies suddenly, and almost immediately, every major power in Europe decides that you are too young, too inexperienced, and worst of all, a woman, to rule. They decide your empire is theirs for the taking. This was the terrifying reality for Maria Theresa. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, had spent nearly his entire reign consumed by one obsession: securing the succession for his daughter. He had no sons, and the ancient laws of the empire usually required a male heir. To overcome this, he spent decades negotiating with every European power, convincing them to sign the Pragmatic Sanction, a document that guaranteed Maria Theresa's right to inherit all the Habsburg lands. He thought he had done everything possible to protect her. But when Charles VI died in October 1740, the ink on those treaties was barely dry before they were tossed aside like old parchment. The first to strike was Frederick II of Prussia, a young, ambitious king who saw an opportunity in Maria Theresa's vulnerability. Without warning, he marched his army into Silesia, a wealthy Habsburg province known for its textile industries and rich farmland. It was a blatant act of aggression, a total betrayal of the treaties his father had signed. Frederick saw a chance to expand his kingdom and make Prussia a major European power, and he figured a young woman wouldn't be able to stop him. Frederick's invasion was like a signal flare. Almost immediately, the rulers of Bavaria, France, Spain, and Saxony, all of whom had signed the Pragmatic Sanction, now conveniently remembered their own ancient claims to Habsburg territories. Bavaria's ruler, Charles Albert, even declared himself the rightful heir to the Holy Roman Empire itself. The empire which Maria Theresa had inherited looked like it would be carved up into pieces, its heart torn out. Maria Theresa's situation was dire. She was young and untested. Her army was small and poorly equipped. Neglected by her peace-loving father, she felt the weight of centuries of Habsburg legacy on her shoulders. She had no time to grieve for her father. She had to fight for her very existence. One of the most dramatic moments came when she traveled to Pressburg, the capital of Hungary. Hungary was a vital part of the Habsburg lands, but its nobility was fiercely independent and had often been rebellious. Maria Theresa, dressed in black mourning clothes, appeared before the Hungarian Diet, holding her infant son Joseph in her arms. She spoke to them passionately, not as their ruler demanding obedience, but as a young mother pleading for help for her child's inheritance, for their shared future. She told them her kingdom was under attack, that she was defenseless, and that she placed her trust in their ancient loyalty. Their response was electrifying. The Hungarian nobles, moved by her courage and vulnerability, drew their swords and famously cried out, "Moriamur pro re nostro Maria Theresia," which translates to "Let us die for our King Maria Theresa." It was a powerful declaration of loyalty, a pledge of blood and steel. Despite this surge of support, the war continued to go badly at first. French and Bavarian forces invaded Bohemia and even captured Prague. Vienna itself seemed threatened. But Maria Theresa, despite her youth, had an iron will. She proved to be a formidable leader. She appointed capable generals like Marshal Khevenholler and her brother-in-law, Prince Charles Alexander of Lorraine. She oversaw reforms in the army despite the ongoing war. She was relentless, tirelessly working, rallying her people and demanding action. The war dragged on for 8 long, bloody years. Battles raged across Europe, from the plains of Silesia to the Low Countries in northern Italy. Maria Theresa suffered defeats, but she also saw her army score victories, slowly pushing back the invaders. Her forces recaptured Prague and pushed the French and Bavarians out of Bohemia. She never gave up fighting for every inch of her inheritance. By 1748, all parties were exhausted. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed, bringing the War of the Austrian Succession to an end. Maria Theresa had to make one painful concession. Silesia, the rich province that Frederick the Great had first seized, remained in Prussian hands. It was a bitter loss that she would never forget, and would try to reclaim in future wars. But despite this, she had kept the rest of her vast inheritance intact. She had secured her place as Empress, proved her strength to a skeptical Europe, and ensured the survival of the Habsburg Empire. A young woman, against all odds, had fought for her crown and won, pulling her family's ancient empire back from the very edge of dissolution. Number 2. The 30 Years' War. Europe's bloodbath and the empire's near death. Imagine a conflict so devastating that it wipes out entire towns, leaves fields barren for generations, and causes millions to die from war, famine, and disease. This was the 30 Years' War, a cataclysm that nearly consumed the Habsburg Empire and plunged Central Europe into an abyss of chaos and death. It began as a religious squabble and morphed into a continental struggle for power, dragging the empire to the very edge of annihilation. The roots of the conflict ran deep, going back to the Protestant Reformation in the previous century. The Holy Roman Empire was a mix of Catholic and Protestant states, and while an earlier peace agreement had tried to balance their rights, tensions simmered. The Habsburg emperors, particularly Ferdinand II, were devout Catholics and wanted to restore the old religious order. Many Protestant princes within the empire viewed this as a direct threat to their autonomy and their faith. The spark that ignited this powder keg happened in Prague in May 1618. A group of angry Protestant noblemen, fed up with what they saw as violations of their religious freedoms by the Habsburg imperial representatives, stormed Prague Castle. They grabbed 2 imperial governors, and their secretary hauled them to a high window and threw them out. This infamous defenestration of Prague was an act of open rebellion, a defiant challenge to Habsburg authority. The Bohemian Protestants declared Ferdinand II, who was soon to become emperor, to be deposed as their king. Ferdinand II, a staunch Catholic and unyielding ruler, would not tolerate such defiance. He quickly amassed an army, and in November 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague, the imperial forces decisively crushed the Bohemian rebels. It seemed like a quick victory, an easy restoration of order. But the emperor's harsh crackdown, afterwards executing Protestant leaders and confiscating their lands, only ignited a wider conflict. Protestant princes across Germany felt threatened, and soon Protestant powers like Denmark and then Sweden joined the fray, turning a local rebellion into a massive European war. One of the most powerful figures to emerge from this chaos was Albrecht von Wallenstein, a brilliant but controversial imperial general. He built a massive private army, funded by plunder, and led the imperial forces to victory after victory, pushing the Protestants back. For a time, it seemed like Wallenstein and Ferdinand II would achieve their goal of recatholizing Germany and strengthening the emperor's power within the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor even issued the Edict of Restitution in 1629, demanding that all church lands seized by Protestants since 1552 be returned to Catholic control. This was a radical move that further alienated Protestant states and pushed more of them into the anti-Habsburg camp. Then came Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden, known as the Lion of the North. A brilliant military innovator, he landed his army in Germany in 1630, determined to protect Protestantism and curb Habsburg power. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Gustavus Adolphus inflicted a crushing defeat on the imperial army. It was a shockwave across Europe. The seemingly invincible Habsburg forces had been humbled, and the empire's position looked incredibly precarious. Wallenstein, after being dismissed by the emperor due to jealousy and fear of his power, was recalled to counter Gustavus Adolphus. The two master strategists clashed, and Gustavus Adolphus was killed in battle in 1632. But the Swedish army remained a potent force. The war spiraled out of control. Armies marched back and forth across Germany, plundering, burning, and killing. Mercenaries, often unpaid, lived off the land, devastating peasant communities. Famine was widespread. Disease, especially plague, spread like wildfire, carried by the soldiers and refugees. Towns that had thrived for centuries were reduced to rubble. Historians estimate that in some areas of Germany, up to 70% of the population died. The Holy Roman Empire was becoming a graveyard, its very structure crumbling under the weight of endless conflict. It was not just a war. It was a societal breakdown. The authority of the emperor, and thus the Habsburgs, seemed to vanish in many places. Even Catholic France, under the cunning Cardinal Richelieu, joined the war against the Habsburgs. In 1635, Richelieu, though a cardinal, put French national interests above religious solidarity. He saw an opportunity to weaken the Habsburgs, France's long-standing rivals, and prevent them from dominating Europe. This shifted the war from primarily a religious conflict to a broader power struggle. With France's entry, the war became even more brutal and prolonged, lasting for another 13 years. By the 1640s, all sides were exhausted. The German lands, the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, were utterly devastated. The emperor's power was at an all-time low. Finally, after years of grueling negotiations, the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648. This monumental treaty reshaped Europe. While the Habsburgs remained emperors, their power within the Holy Roman Empire was severely curtailed. The individual states within the empire gained much more autonomy, effectively limiting the emperor's central authority. The religious divisions were formalized, and the idea of a universal Catholic empire in Central Europe was shattered. The Habsburg Empire, specifically its Austrian core lands, survived the 30 Years' War, but it was a close call. The war had nearly torn it apart, demonstrating the fragility of its multi-layered structure. The Habsburgs had to shift their focus more towards their own hereditary lands in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, building a stronger, more centralized state there. They had endured a cataclysm that pushed them to the brink of total collapse. But they had also learned a harsh lesson about the limits of their power and the importance of adapting to a new, more fragmented European order. Number 1. The Ottoman Siege of Vienna, 1683. When the walls almost fell, imagine the sound of drums, thousands of them, beating rhythmically, growing louder with each passing day. Imagine the sight of a vast foreign army stretching for miles, covering the horizon, its banners snapping in the wind, its numbers seemingly endless. This was the chilling reality for the people of Vienna in the summer of 1683. The Ottoman Empire, a formidable Islamic power that had for centuries been pushing into Christian Europe, was at their gates, and this time it seemed poised to deliver the final, crushing blow. The Habsburg Empire had a long and often bloody history with the Ottomans. For over 150 years since their first siege of Vienna in 1529, the Ottomans had been a constant threat on the Habsburg eastern frontier in Hungary. They have fought countless battles, and much of Hungary remained under Ottoman control. But in 1683, the Ottoman Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, had assembled an army of unprecedented size, estimated at over 150,000 soldiers, determined to conquer Vienna and open the path to the heart of Europe. As news of the approaching Ottoman horde reached Vienna, panic spread like wildfire. Emperor Leopold I, along with his court, his family, and many of the wealthy citizens, made the painful decision to flee the city. They headed west, seeking refuge in Linz and then Passau. This act, while perhaps militarily pragmatic to ensure the survival of the imperial line, was a devastating blow to the morale of those left behind. The city was abandoned to its fate, left to defend itself. But Vienna was not without brave leaders. Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the city's military commander, was a stern but resolute man. He was tasked with defending the city with a mere 15,000 regular soldiers, reinforced by armed citizens and volunteers. Starhemberg knew the odds were stacked against him, but he famously declared, "I will not surrender even if I have to eat dirt." He oversaw the frantic preparations, strengthening the walls, hoarding supplies, and assigning every able-bodied man and woman a role in the defense. The city became a fortress. Waiting for the inevitable, the siege began in earnest in July. Cannonballs slammed into the ancient walls, tearing chunks of stone from the ramparts. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder, but the most terrifying threat came from beneath the ground. The Ottomans were master miners. They dug tunnels under the city walls, packed them with explosives, and detonated them, creating massive breaches. The defenders had to constantly dig countermines, listening for the sounds of Ottoman shovels, often engaging in desperate claustrophobic hand-to-hand combat in the dark, narrow tunnels underground. Inside the city, life became a nightmare. Food and water became scarce. Disease, fueled by unsanitary conditions and constant stress, began to spread through the crowded cellars. Where many sought refuge, the defenders were exhausted, wounded, and desperate. Time was running out. By early September, the Ottoman mines had created massive gaps in the walls. Ottoman troops poured through the breaches, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Starhemberg sent desperate messages using signals and brave messengers who slipped through enemy lines begging for relief. "No time to lose, no time to lose," he wrote. "Vienna is lost without quick help." Europe watched with bated breath. The fate of Christendom seemed to hang in the balance. Finally, a relief army hastily assembled from various German princes and, crucially, a powerful contingent from Poland began its march. Led by the brave and matic Polish king Jan III Sobieski and joined by Duke Charles V of Lorraine, the Habsburg general, this multinational force represented Europe's last hope. On September 11th, the relief army arrived on the Kallenberg Hills. The sight of their banners visible from the besieged city sent a jolt of hope through the weary defenders. The next day, September 12, 1683, the decisive battle began. Sobieski's cavalry, including his legendary winged hussars, heavy cavalry known for their distinctive wings, thunderously charged down the hills. The Ottomans, caught between the charging relief army and the desperate searching defenders from within the city walls, broke and fled in disarray. Kara Mustafa Pasha, disgraced, escaped, leaving behind a massive camp full of treasures and supplies. Vienna was saved. The victory was monumental. It marked a turning point in the long struggle between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. For the first time in centuries, the tide decisively turned in Europe's favor. The Habsburg Empire, having faced annihilation, emerged with immense prestige, cementing its role as a defender of Europe against the Ottoman threat. This victory would launch a century of Habsburg expansion into Hungary and the Balkans, pushing back the Ottoman Empire and securing its own borders. It was the closest the Habsburgs had come to being utterly crushed by an external enemy. But their desperate resistance and the timely arrival of their allies had pulled them back from the very brink. They had looked death in the eye, and somehow they had lived to tell the tale.